So this session is on hybrid Power BI with the on-premise data gateway. So just to check everyone's on the right track. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bob Duffy. I've been working in the database and BI sector quite a long time, 30 years now. So I'm sort of quite ancient at this point. I'm a SQL Server certified architect, certified master and an MVP on the SQL platform, and on the analysis services platform, I'm an SSAS Maestro. I used to work at Microsoft as a data platform consultant, and I now work at Prodata, where I'm a database architect, helping customers in Ireland with more challenging sort of enterprise solutions. Okay. So what we're going to chat about is the gateway architecture, like, what is it, how it works. I'll briefly go over install, configure, security, and how to deploy it. And then we'll do a couple of tests to show you it working with other technologies other than Power BI, for example, Power Automate or Microsoft Flows, it used to be called. So first of all, Power BI in the cloud works with a massive number of data sources. I tried to count them and I kept losing count, right? So there's sort of out of the box, it can connect to both data sources, but also applications are building connectors. So any cloud-based application or software as a service platform that's worth their salt is going to have a connector for Power BI, Salesforce, Google, Microsoft Dynamics, and so forth, right? So you can connect either data or applications natively into Power BI, and you don't need the gateway for this, right? So if your entire set of data sources is one of these cloud-born pieces of data, you're basically living the cloud dream as far as data goes, right? You can suck them into Power BI, and you make queries or mashups that make sort of a data set that you make the reports on. You publish this up to the Power BI service in the cloud, where it's cached and stored, and end users can then query that over the browser or over the native app if they're on the mobile phone. It's all secured using Azure Active Directory, so every user has a log on the Azure Active Directory. Okay. Now, the problem that I have in my job, and the problem that most of you have, is specifically enterprise customers aren't living the dream 100%, right? Not all of your data is going to be one of the cloud-based sets of data, right? You're going to have on-premise sets of data, be that SQL servers, super common, analysis services, models, Excel spreadsheets, files, mainframes. Not every customer has 100% of the data in the cloud. In fact, in my experience, most of the data for the Irish companies that I work with isn't in the cloud. It's more they're aspiring to eventually get there. Okay, so in this scenario, it doesn't work so well because the Power BI service needs to connect to the on-premise, and it's going to have a difficulty doing this. So that's the role that the gateway plays. Okay, now it works in two modes, right? Either a live mode or a direct query mode, where the user clicks a graphic and the query is run exactly that kind of second on the kind of data source and the result set comes back, or a cached mode where it's refreshed once per day or something like that, and it's the kind of gateway passes up the whole of the data set so it can then be sort of cached in the cloud. Okay, so that's the role that the gateway plays. Okay, so let's just see a demo of that in action, right? So I'm going to connect to I've got a VM here that has a SQL Server and various other bits and pieces. I can launch Power BI, and as you say, when I click Get Data, it'll give me a choice of all of these cloud-based databases, right? And a whole, there's a wide array of data sources that I can connect to. But I'm going to connect to an on-premise data source. I'm going to connect to an analysis server, and I'm going to connect to one that's not hosted in the cloud. It's just hosted on a normal VM, and I can choose to import in cached mode or connect to live. So I'm going to connect live. I'm going to select my database, and I've now I'll now get a live connection. And on the right-hand side of the screen here, I've got an object browser. So I can select dates. I might want to select a couple of measures. Let's go for, widen that box, but internet total sales maybe, okay? I can use the visualizations in Power BI to kind of render that, okay? Now this sort of talk isn't about how to make sort of pretty dashboards and charts, right? So I'm going to move to here's one I prepared earlier, right? So spent a few minutes making up this one, and this is the exact same. The sort of data source is effectively connecting back to a live analysis services. And what you see is I have all of the interaction. So I can click to say, right, show me sales in Paris. I can go to United Kingdom to say how many bike sales and so forth. Okay. Now, when I'm ready to publish that, I can publish that up into the cloud. And I can select a workspace that I want to publish it into. And this is where the problem arises, because I'm running Power BI desktop on premise and my data source is on premise. So when I click to connect, happy days, I have a connection. But when I go to the cloud now, if I go to that same report here, so here's that same report that I've actually published, and I haven't done any configuration of any gateways or anything, I'll get this error message. No, not this one here. There is no gateway to access the data source, okay? And it's going to give me a hint on how to configure it, right? Because effectively the cloud doesn't have a connection to on premise there, okay? So that's the need for the gateway. So before I show how about configuring it, how does it work? Well, what happens is you have your cloud-based applications, including Power BI, right? And they can use the gateway, and you have your on-premise sets of data here, be that SQL Analysis Services or even flat files, right? So what happens is your Power BI, for example, will make a request, and the Power BI report will sort of make up a query in whatever language the sort of source of data have, DAX, SQL, MDX, or whatever, right? It will put that query on an Azure service bus along with the credentials to connect to that query, obviously secured and encrypted and stuff like that, right? Okay. Now, when it does that, there's an on-premise gateway which is installed on a server on-premise, and that's basically connected to the service bus. So as soon as the query is on there, it picks up the query, pulls it down, decides how to run that query, runs it, and it'll get back a results set, a table of data basically that it will serialize and put on the service bus, which is then pulled back up to the cloud and rendered by Power BI. Okay, now obviously that adds a little bit of latency. In our tests, a couple of milliseconds, most of the times in the execution of the query, especially if it's quite a large query. And bear in mind that Power BI doesn't tend to pull down more than 501 rows. So, the size of the result set coming back generally isn't too much of a problem. Okay. So we need to install the gateway in order to get this report that we've just made, right? Now there's two flavors of gateway. There is a personal and a standard mode. I don't know anyone who uses the personal mode because it's very limited and it doesn't work with live connections and various other bits and pieces. But you do need administrator rights on the server to install the standard one. So if you were in a super lockdown environment and just wanted to experiment, you could use the personal one, but most people go straight for the standard gateway. So you just click on that, download it, and then start the install, right? Install is the easiest install out of any Microsoft product. It is literally a next. I mean, we install a lot of these and we don't tend to change any options at all, really, right? So we decide where we want to put it. We decide an email just to authenticate to see what Power BI services are available. After we've authenticated, we can register a new gateway and then it will install it. It'll install both the Windows service on the server that we've installed to it, and also a cloud service on the Power BI service in the cloud that kind of matches it. So sort of two ends of the gateway as such, right? And then it'll do a test to actually check it's online. Okay. Now it runs under a service account, which we'll chat about kind of later on, which by default is a virtual service account, or VSA. It's just a local account that can only be used by the data gateway. Okay, so we chatted about the kind of service account. So there is a choice. You could, if you wanted to, use a domain account or a local account or anything like that. This account that you install it under, a lot of people get confused under. This account is not used to query any of the data sources. So as a best practice, this account shouldn't be allowed any query access to any of your SQL servers or anything like that. It's purely used to get an internet connection to connect to the Azure service bus. So it doesn't need any rights to any data. So we always stick with the default virtual service account, but you can, if you want to, use a domain account. The only situation where you might use a domain account, apart from it being mandated by some sort of security policy, is if you're connecting to the internet via a proxy and the proxy needs to have authentication by a domain service account, well, it's going to have to run under a domain kind of service account. I would very much caution about doing a lot of connection to Power BI by using a proxied connection as opposed to a rooted connection, though, because you will get latency and issues with caching and authentication and so forth. So often we chat to customers about getting a rooted connection, and Microsoft do have a white paper on what exceptions you can put in your proxying kind of system in order to get a rooted connection to the internet for Power BI and Azure. Okay, there is a cloud gateway service, as I said. So the install actually installs both the cloud part of the gateway and the on-premise part as well, right? And what you do is you register a bunch of data sources. So one per data source that you want to connect with, right? As a best practice, we try and name it with the name of the database that we're connecting to, and maybe whether it's a SQL or an analysis services or an Excel connection or something like that. Just for troubleshooting purposes, if you call it something like sort of Bob's data source and Jim's data source, it could be harder for other people to sort of understand what they're for. Okay. So let's do a demo of that. So I'm obviously not going to install the gateway. So I've pre-installed the gateway. And what you'll see is when I pre-installed the gateway in my services, I will have a there will be a gateway services. Changed the name recently. There's on-premise data gateway here. And you see that it's running away and it's installed with this virtual service account here. Okay, so I've got my gateway running and there is a configuration utility that I can run to check it's running and everything else. So now that it's working, I'll see this. I can go to settings, manage gateways. I can see that I can add these data sources. So I've added two. One is to an analysis services for a live connection. The other one is I've made a connection to a SQL server. So I've got a connection to an analysis services and a connection to a SQL server here. And now when I go into the report, if I go into the report content, go into AdventureWorks here, let's close that old error there, you'll see the report's working. And if I run something, I'm just running the background SQL profiler just to show you the queries come in real time. So I'm in the cloud, but as I click, you can see, well, first of all, you'll see it seems to be as responsive as the on kind of premise one, really, right? And when you go to SQL profiler, you'll see here's all the DAX queries that have been fired, how long they took, and so forth. Okay, so that's an example of the gateway being used for a live connection. Okay, let's flip back. Now, nearly every customer that we have wants some form of security, right? And this is where it's a little bit more challenging because you want to have a single sign-on. So you want to be able to sign on to the cloud, but for that same sign-on to be used by the on-premise. But in the cloud, you've got Azure Active Directory, and on-premise, you've got Active Directory. Okay. Now, the single sign-on is mainly for analysis services, but there are other data sources that use flavors of it as well, right? So everything is done by the UPN of the user principal name, right? So on your Office 365 tenant, you'll have a UPN suffix, like mine is @prodata.ie, right? And what'll happen is the gateway will pass the user down the service bus and say, hey, can you impersonate this guy when you run the query? Okay. Now, if your UPN on your Active Directory is the same as in the cloud, happy days, it will just work, right? And for a lot of smaller customers, that just works like that. Otherwise, it won't work because you could be Bob at Prodata in the cloud, but you could be Bob at prodata.local on premise. So there's a few ways of fixing that, right? Here's an example of an error message that you'll get if you look at Profiler when it's not working, right? The first thing is there is a mapping feature, right? So if you go into the data source and go into the advanced options of settings, you'll see that you can replace strings to say, hey, when you get @prodata.ie, replace it with @prodata.local. So that's exactly what I've done in this scenario, because obviously my demo is in a completely different domain than my Office 365. Okay, so that's the first thing that you can do. What we've done for a lot of our customers is they've just changed the UPN on kind of premise to match the Office 365. So if you can do that, that's great. And we've actually found that there weren't too many applications really using that, so it worked fine. The more complex scenario could be you've got an enterprise customer with lots of AD forests, and every forest has either the same kind of UPN or different ones. Now, there are advanced features that allows you to do mapping where it can query a global catalog server and it can automatically swap out for the NetBIOS version of the username. Now, that's quite advanced, but if anyone runs into problems with that, definitely ping me, because we've been working for a lot of customers and we've spent a lot of time actually getting this working, right? Okay, deployment options, right? So the gateway runs as a Windows service, right? So there's not one best practice. I mean, there is a white paper that Microsoft have on deploying. We typically follow like 3 or 4 different design patterns, and it depends on a few things, right? Design pattern 1 is you've just got one VM which has everything installed onto it. You might have a SQL database, you might have on-premise reporting services, you might have analysis services, you might have SSAS running, and you're just going to use the gateway to connect, right? So if you've got a small number of users, like 50 or so, and you don't want to spin up a new VM, and the only purpose of the gateway is to connect to the data warehouse or the analysis services, this isn't a bad option because you're getting data locality. The gateway doesn't have to transfer data across the network, right? More commonly, we tend to see this type of design pattern where a customer is going to at least build a separate BI server, and the gateway is connecting to the analysis services, say, or maybe the data warehouse as well, right? So the gateway typically goes on the BI server and not on the data warehouse server, right? Now, if your gateway isn't only used for BI, if it's used across the whole enterprise and it's used for flow and there's lots of users, you're going to have to think about having a dedicated server, right? So you're going to spin up a server, it's just going to have the gateway running. Good news is it's not a licensed product, right? So you haven't got to pay for any Power BI licenses or SQL licenses or anything like that. So you're just have to pay for the Windows license, right? Now, there is a high availability mode where you can do load balancing between the gateways. We do not have a customer big enough in Ireland to have this configuration. Now, you might have it for high availability, but a lot of our customers are running on Hyper-V or VMware on premise, or they might be running on VMs in Azure infrastructure as a service. In all of those cases, you kind of have high availability built into the platform, i.e. if the hardware crashes, it's going to spin up on another node, right? So you'll have to decide if you want to also load balance the gateway as well. As I say, we have not yet installed a load balance configuration, and we have had some quite large customers with 3,000 to 5,000 users. Okay. So so that's the deployment options. Now let's have a look at some other stuff that you can do with it, right? Because I've showed you it working with at a basic level. Let's look at authentication working or row level security, for example, right? So if I go to my demo here, I've got a user called USA@prodata.ie, right? And you'll see that when I connect and go to my report, they automatically only see the region of the United States. So that's row level security, right? It's the exact same report that's actually running, but when I run it, I see all the countries of the world and they only see the US, right? And this is effectively the gateway taking the username that it sees in the cloud, which would be USA@prodata.ie, passing it down the gateway, and it's getting mapped to USA.@ad.local. Okay, so if you see at the settings here, if I go into the gateways, oh, hold on, I'm obviously they're not an administrator, so they're not going to be able to see that, right? Hold on. Let's go to me. Go to the gateways, and you'll see that when I go to the data source settings and the users, I've activated this map usernames thing on the right hand side of the screen. So you can see I've mapped between the Office 365 domain and whatever the local AD domain is here, right? So that's how that sort of mapping works. And when I look at the queries that are executed, right? So as I get this USA user, right? Let's just get this USA user, run some reports. Right, let's click on a few things, right? Now let's go and see the queries that are executed. So here's all the queries that are executed. You'll see it's the same username that connected, right? Whatever was configured, right? But there's in the connection string, there's an effective username sent. Let's see. There you go. See, I'm just going to highlight it here. Effective username, and that's effectively the impersonation inactive. So it connected as whatever the data source was configured with, and then it switched the username to the actual user to do the security part. So that's that in operation. And the last thing I want to show you is let's have a look at things outside of Power BI, right? Power Apps, right? How are we on time? We're okay on time. Oh yeah, we're actually fairly good on time, right? So I'm going to look at what used to be sort of Microsoft Flow, and I've built a Microsoft Flow to also use the gateway, right? So what I've done, I'll just show you this in, I'll just go back to my screen here. All right, so here's my VM. I've made a survey in Microsoft Forms. Amazing laptop survey. So this is the audience participation, right? You're going to vote for your favorite kind of laptop. Okay, I'll give you the URL in a second. I just want to go through like how it works. So what I've done is I've gone to Power Automate. I've created a flow. I'm just going to edit the flow and show you what it's doing here. It's got an event trigger on Microsoft Forms that say, hey, when a form is submitted from this particular survey, I want you to get the first response, and then this SQL shape will actually use the data gateway to insert the data to an on-premise SQL server, right? And I've defined a table here and put this field from the survey in that column, that field from the survey in that column, that field from the survey in that column. And after you have done that, I want you to squirt it real time into a Power BI data set in the cloud. Okay, so I'm storing it in two places. One is on premise for permanent storage. The other is in the cloud for BI and presentation purposes. Okay, so let's see that in action, right? So let's go back to my so here's the flow that we just chat about. I've also defined an alert in Power BI to say as soon as I get 15 responses to send me an email and tell me what the best laptop is, right? Okay. So there's a second flow that does that as well. I don't know if I've configured that one at the moment, right? So to start this off, if you guys could, if people on the call could go to this kind of URL here, okay? And when you do that, you'll get to the survey. Okay, now I'm going to go to it here. You'll get to this kind of survey here, and in Power BI I have made up a report, laptop survey, and I've got a live kind of dashboard and a report. Okay, so I can go to survey results here, right? So there's no responses there. I go to the live results here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in a survey. So my favorite laptop, well, I like the XPS, although I'm getting a bit of noise from this one, so I'm going to click submit.
Bob, can you show the QR code again just for a moment so that we can scan that?
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. Just going to show you my one response, and then I'll come back to show you the QR code here. Okay. So I'll leave that on the screen, and there's also a URL at the top that I made, sql.ie/survey, right? So just give people a time to go into there. Right, hopefully everyone's, and we can maybe drop that in the chat. You can drop the sql.ie survey into the chat. Can I? Ba-ba. Okay, now what I want to show you though is so obviously this is a survey in the cloud, right? It's kind of Microsoft Forms, right? So if I go to my on-premise SQL server, the flow is going to be putting the data in, right? If it's running. Check out my flow. Oh no. Epic demo fail. So that's a shame. What I'm going to do is I get to show you the sort of troubleshooting of the data gateway. Right. So what I can do is I can do a test. So if I get a failure, I can do a test, and I can select a response that I want to. So I'm going to do a test. Low one failed. Oh, typical. It failed at the business there. Oh. Yeah, so it's an authentication issue. It's saying the user account that the flow is running at that hasn't got access to the connection. Interesting enough, it did a couple of seconds ago. So troubleshooting wise, I can go to the gateway. And I can see here's my data source. I can click on test just to check that's working. I can check the user that it's going to run at, which is that one. It's fine. That has access. That seems to be good. And I can go back and edit the flow. Seems to be there. Ba, ba, ba. Check the connection. Now, one thing I should mention though is the Power Automate or Microsoft Flow comes in a few flavors, right? You've got the Office 365 flavor, which is the most common. When you're connecting to SQL Server, the connecting via the gateway is a premium feature. You see that word sort of premium there, and that means you need the more licensed version. If you're connecting to a SQL Server in Azure that isn't using the gateway, you don't need to pay for the enhanced version of Microsoft Flow or Power Automate. Okay, so that's just a consideration in that if you're choosing where to put your SQL Server, if you put your SQL Server in Azure, like it's hosted in Azure, you won't need the gateway, and you might get away with sort of cheaper licensing on the Microsoft Flow. Okay, now I was hoping I can get that working, but everything seems to be configured, so it might take a while to get it working. It looks like an authentication issue between the user that the flow is running under and the SQL Server connection. But so sorry about that. Okay, so we're fairly good on time. That was quite a quick one. I'll stop for any questions that people have there. Anyone have any questions there?
Would anybody like to jump off mute and ask a question? We don't have anything in the chat at the moment.
Hi, this is Neil. I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Hi, Bob. How you doing, mate? You okay?
Good. Yeah. How's things?
Good. Thanks for the material. That's good. So, so one question I have is, if I've got a kind of a large number of kind of systems on my on-premises, and I'm using my gateway and I'm trying to kind of commit it, what's the security kind of who can configure that? So I kind of was stepping in and out of your presentation because I've got a couple of other tracks running. But can you just kind of, how do you configure that, and what security can we put around the kind of gateways? Yeah,
so great question, right? Obviously there's two aspects to the server. One is the security. One is the Windows side of it, right? So who can configure the gateway on the Windows server? Because you're stopping and starting Windows services, you're generally a Windows administrator on that box, right? Now the cloud-based side of it is a little bit more difficult, right? So the easiest thing is for me to flick to show you the settings page, right? So I'm just going to go to the settings page for the gateway in the cloud, right? There you go. Yeah. Right. So if I go to the PowerBI, if I go to the gateway settings here, right, you'll see there's a number of different security levels, right? One is, right, for the gateway itself, for each gateway, who is an administrator of the gateway, Okay.
Cool.
And someone who's an administrator of the gateway can add extra data sources and so forth. Okay, so you're probably going to have a limited number of people who can add extra data sources. Now, this is a challenge we've had on customer sites because, say, for example, an accountant can make up a mashup that has got an Excel file in it, right? And depending how it's configured, he could have looped over a folder, in which case that folder has got to be added as it, or he could have hard coded a file. So generally what we do is we have to set up, we're here to request for us to add the kind of source for him, right? Because we might not want to give users access to add extra data sources, right? The other level of security is in the data source, right? So if I go to, if I go back into the gateway settings here, right? And I just go into a data source, okay? You've got this thing called users of the data source, and this confused us at first, right? So when we first started working on Power BI like years ago, we thought that everyone who used the report had to be on this list, right? So we added the whole organization and we got really miffed because every time a new user got added, we were coming here and we were adding them. And then we realized, no, it's actually just for people, if you read that wording, people who can publish reports. So for someone to make up a new report that uses that kind of data source, they have to be a registered user. But just to consume the data source, they don't necessarily have to be in the users section here, right? But what they do need to be is whatever workspace or application it's in, they obviously have to have security on that. Okay. Now, depending whether it's cached or live, if it's cached, that is pretty much all they need. If it's live, they're going to also need to have access on the source of data. So if it's an analysis services, they're going to have to be in an AD group that has kind of query access to the sort of tables. Does that explain the sort of cycle of a few of the levels of the security there?
Yeah, I got a few of my kind of customers confused a little bit about, well, I've got data on my laptop or desktop or whatever, and I've got this thing, the service, and they were getting a little bit confused, and it's like just kind of clarify kind of that we need this gateway and how you can control the security,
exactly,
etc. So yeah, thanks for that. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, and a key thing here is the username and password that you key in the sort of data source is the credentials that are used to connect to the on-premise, right? But if it's a live connection, it doesn't have to be the user that it's actually executed as, because of the effective username is like impersonation happens, right? So it'll do the initial connection under the username and password that was set up, and then it switched the connection to be the actual user running. One thing is, if it's an analysis services, the username and password that's keyed in here has got to be an administrator of the analysis services, because you have to be an administrator in order to impersonate anyone else, right?
I'm constantly impersonating people all the time.
Oh yeah. Question from Ben there on load balancing. Yeah, and that also leads on to a question on capacity. So one of the most common questions I have is, how big should do I need a dedicated box to run the gateway on, and how big should that box be, right? And the question that then kind of leads on from there is, do I need to load balance in it, right? And what drives the need for load balancing, right? So if we go back to the deck here, to this deployment options, right, you can see that you can move between a monolithic, all of my BI and data all on a single VM, right? To I'll have my core data services on one and my BI on another, to something like that. And you can gradually move components. Like you might say, well, I've got Power BI Premium, so I'm going to move my reporting services into the cloud service, right? So, the roles can move around. But when do I switch from here to here, and how big does that box need to be, right? So let's deal with the when do I move to 2 servers, right? So there's 2 tenants when you move to 2 servers, right? One, a single box is not large enough, right? Which I don't think, unless you're the size of Microsoft, you're not going to hit that. Like, so if you've got thousands of users making mashups and all the mashups are being processed at the same time, you're going to find that whatever time they run, be that sort of 7 o'clock in the morning, the CPU on the box is going to get absolutely hammered, and it's going to queue everything. It's going to go really, really slow, right? So if you're using cached mode and you're making mashups, you got to see how much CPU you need, and you might decide, well, rather than go from an 8 to a 16 core, I'm going to go to 2 8 cores, and I'm going to get some load balancing working, right? So capacity of CPU is one thing that would kind of drive it, okay? The other thing that would drive it is the need for ultra high availability. Now, bearing in mind, as I said, like every environment that I know of has a highly available VMware, like a highly available VM. So if you're in Azure and the hardware blows up, it'll reboot on another box, yeah? Or if the hardware is being maintained by patching, it'll move to another box before it does the sort of patching, right? So kind of downtime, I think Microsoft give you a 99 point, are they 9599 on single VM, or is it still a 99.9? But there's a fairly good SLA on single VMs, right? If that SLA is not good enough for you, and you're like, no, I want like 3 nines, right? Well, then you're going to want to implement load balancing so that in the event of one of them not working, it can be seamlessly redirected. So for me, that's the tenants. One is CPU, the other is load balancing. Now, if you're using VMs in Azure, and you had a lot of users, you could do something like, I'll run with 16 CPUs until midday, and then I'll scale it back to 4 CPUs, and you can try and save some sort of cost there, but we don't see a lot of customers doing that. Nearly all customers that we have are running from a 4-core, to tell you the truth, right? But it depends on your workload. If you're using live queries, you don't need a lot of CPU because it's not doing a lot of work. But if you're using mashups, you're effectively doing all the ETL work on that box, right? And therefore the CPU drives up. So what we generally do is we start off at a 4-core, have a look at how many mashups they're doing, and then decide to move to 8 or more cores. So hopefully that makes sense. I think the largest number of users that we've got on or user base that we've got on a single gateway is about 3,500 users. But that's for live queries. That's not for cache queries.
Okay, Bob, I think you've addressed everything. Has anybody got anything else they want to jump on and ask? We don't have anything else in the chat. I think it's just testament to the fact that it was a really comprehensive coverage of the topic, Bob, to be honest. You've covered a great deal there for us. That's excellent stuff. Oh, and some compliments coming through as well. That's always nice. Is there anything else that you wanted to add? You could have another 10 minutes if you would like it.
No, that's fine. I think it's just a walkthrough of the gateway, its architecture, how it works, install, configuration, and showing some of the different aspects of it, be it live connections versus Power Automate. But the kind of message is it is very easy to install, and it only gets more complex when you're dealing with enterprise architectures. So, for example, we have a customer that has multiple AD forests. So we've got to work with their AD team to make sure that UPNs flow, and we can get the same identity working in the cloud and on premise. But for a lot of people, it just works out of the box. Next.
in your experience then, apart from the Power Automate issue that you had on there, what is the big gotcha? What's going to be the one that people are going to come up against more often than not?
I guess what Neil mentioned, confusion over the security, right? Because you see the users tab and you're like, oh, I bang all my users in there, right? So that can be a bit of a problem. Not understanding which of the data accounts are making the connection. So they might put a data account to connect. One of the most common problems that we've seen is just people putting their own kind of username into the data source, and then their password expiring.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Right, so that's probably, if you were to ask me for the most common gateway issue, I'd be willing to bet money that's got to be a number one, right? Probably the number two issue, if we're going for family fortunes, I'd say the number two issue has got to be it's on the rapid support policy by Microsoft. So new versions of the gateway come out at the time and customers forget to update it. And eventually it just stops working. It's like, hey, man, you're like 3 versions out of date. And I don't think Microsoft do the regression testing back, for all of the different versions of the gateway. Or what happened is a new version of Power BI desktop will actually come out and using a new feature, they haven't updated the gateway. So you kind of got to keep the gateway up to date. Yeah, that's probably the second most common issue that we see. I don't know if anyone else on the call has any other common issues that they've seen, but those are definitely 2 for me. Obviously the UPN kind of matching at the enterprise level is, that's big.
Okay. Again, has anybody come across any issues that they want to air? We've got a good 5 minutes. Throw it at an expert. Something hard.
Yeah. That's a leading question. Yeah. So this is this is a gotcha actually. Is a great gotcha actually. Deepak, is when you install it, there is a recovery key, right? Now the installation process, you can install a gateway in about a minute, right? So when I first started working, I was like, hey, what do I need a recovery key for? Because I can install it in a minute, right? The problem is if you don't have the recovery key and you reinstall it, you kind of lose your data sources and all of the accounts. Unless you have all the usernames, passwords, you're going to spend a long time trying to reset it up. I mean, we've got one of our customers that's got maybe 50 data sources. So it's definitely a best practice to store that recovery key. The other thing we found out is if you do something funky like change the service account, it uses that as part of the encryption salt. So you'll lose all the encrypted data. So all the usernames and passwords that you used to connect to all the data sources, gone if you change the service account. So basically, don't change the service account. Stick it as a VSA or stick it as a domain account. So yeah, do. And I haven't found a way to extract the recovery key if you forgot to make a note of it when you keyed it in. So if anyone does know, drop us an email because yeah, I'd like to know that myself.
That's excellent, and that was a decent gotcha. Bob, do you have any contact details we can just flash up on the screen so that people can reach out to you?
Yeah. And there's a question from Ben there on the monitoring there actually. I'll go through on the monitoring. That's a great one actually, because there is some monitoring that we do on capacity planning actually. I'll flash a slide if anyone has anything. So that's my contact details there, bob@prodata.ie. So if you have any questions questions on the gateway, certainly drop us an email or on sort of Twitter Bob_Duffy. Don't get confused with any of the other Bob Duffys. I think if you forget the underscore, you might get the mayor of New York, right?
He probably doesn't know the answer.
Yeah, he might not know the answer, right? Monitoring and troubleshooting. Oh my God, I forgot one of the biggest problems that we have. So I cut down the content a little bit, kind of maybe too aggressively. Probably the third biggest problem is firewall and network considerations, right? If you want a super lockdown customer, the gateway needs to connect to Azure. If the internet connection is blocked, that's obviously not going to happen, right? So they need to have outbound ports connected to the Azure kind of services, and there's a white paper here that I've got that has all of those. Microsoft do actually have a web service, because the problem is the list of servers that it connects to is like it's hundreds, right? And the list of IPs is 100. So if you're in a lockdown environment and the customer's like, no, I'm not going to open up port 5671 to any server, only to Microsoft servers, the problem is the list grows. So what we did on one customer site is there's a web service that Microsoft have that lists the IPs for the data center, and they had a script on the router that ran once a week, downloaded the IP list and updated the router rules. So definitely the firewall. Now on the config program, there is a test firewall button, which is pretty good, right? That will actually tell you if there's a problem. So that's good. Performance and monitoring, right? There's a perfmon. All of this has perfmon counters, right? So you can run perfmon, you can get the counters, right? If you were going to the nth degree on kind of monitoring to see if it's performing well, a good thing, I like this counter here, the number of items in the service bus pool, right? Because if that's starting to queue up, it means that your on-premise gateway isn't working fast enough, and that's a potential indication that you either need more CPU or to move to load balancing, right? So that is there. The number one metric is the bottom. You're going to want to look at the CPU utilization, because if it's running hot, then you got to see, is it just running hot at 4 o'clock in the morning and you're like, okay, I don't care about that, it can queue a bit then, or is it causing a user experience issue where you're like, well, we're going to have to address that. I said a lot of our customers are using analysis services, so the CPU yield doesn't tend to go more than 10% of the CPU being used by the gateway, and we're quite happy with that. So that's monitoring. Troubleshooting, it does dump a diagnostics log, which is pretty good. So here's the gateway logs. You can put on diagnostics mode, and any error received will give you the full .NET stack trace, which is quite useful. So and that's all accessible via the configuration app. So that's quite good there. So just show that. If I go to the configuration app, sign in. Yeah. Hopefully it doesn't have two-factor authentication. It does. Oh. So I had updated that to the right gateway. Maybe I didn't. Okay, that might be one of the problems. Yeah, so see this? You can turn on additional login, which I wouldn't do in full production, but then you can export all the logs, and there's a button here to do a network port test. And what this will do is it will check that you've got the, haha, that's interesting. Just done a network port test and it's suddenly started failing. Look at that. You guys see that? Wow, that's interesting, especially because this is an Azure VM actually running in Azure and it doesn't have a firewall installed. So I wonder if there's a service issue. I'll have to look at that later on. There is the option, which I would never do, to switch to HTTPS mode. The reason I wouldn't is because by default the service bus uses a binary mode, which is data is sort of compressed a little bit. Like binary transport is much faster than a text-based transport. But if you're really in a lockdown environment and you really can't convince them to get a proper internet connection, you might have to switch to HTTPS mode. That's super interesting. The network port test failing. I'll look at that kind of later on, but I wonder if that's a problem with the service. Okay.
So excellent, Bob. Thank you so much for that. You broke Azure, but I think other than that, that was an excellent session. And we're actually now in danger of going overtime, so well filled. Right. Thank you ever so much for that. If anybody does want to get in touch, this session will be recorded and available on YouTube for those that were asking, and we will have the contact details on there for you to get directly in touch with Bob for anything else that you want to ask. Yep, again, great. Thank you very much.